This is Cyndy Adeniyi from Out of the Woods. I'm so glad that you are here today. Today we're going to be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. You probably have heard it called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is actually the first of two videos on the subject. In this video, we're going to just kind of look at what the formal definition is as defined by the DSM-5. We'll talk a little bit about what that book is. And then the second video, we're going to look at how we as believers can help those who are struggling with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and how we can help them to do so in a way that is both Christ-centered and emotionally healthy. The two videos, let's dive in to what we'll be doing today, and that is looking at the formal definition for post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the formal definition for those of us in the mental health field is going to come from the American Psychiatric Association's manual. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, but we all call it the DSM-5. And it's a great big fat purple book with all sorts of lists in it that help us to identify what is what within the realm of mental health diagnosis. And whenever I bring up the DSM-5 in the Christian community, I would like to make this disclaimer. The Word of God, the Bible, is inerrant. It is inerrant, it is infallible, it is truth. The DSM is fallible. It has errors. There are problems with it. And a lot of times we treat it as if it's the Word of God, and it's not. It just isn't. And that's why there's 5 editions of it, because there was something wrong with editions 1 through 4. And there are already people complaining about 5, and 5 just came out a few years ago. So let's not get too caught up into what this says, but this is what we use in order to determine who has PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder and who maybe is dealing with something else, maybe something less severe. This is the book that we use, and we recognize that it is fallible. Now, the book, which is, I think, over 1,000 pages, just under, it has a couple of pages dedicated specifically to the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And what I'm going to do is go over the diagnostic criteria for adults. Now, it's different for children under 6, but we're going to go through the criteria for adults just so that you can really know when somebody is diagnosed with this, what is that diagnosis supposed to include? What types of symptoms? What are we seeing when we have someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder? Okay, the first is exposure to something traumatic. And that could be an actual or threatened death, a serious injury, sexual assault, and we go into the different ways that that can happen. So first would be directly experiencing the traumatic event. Secondly would be witnessing it happening to somebody else. So this could be, for example, not that somebody shot at me, that would be a direct traumatic event, but I witnessed someone shooting at somebody else. That too can cause PTSD. Learning that a traumatic event occurred to a close loved one or a family member. So finding out that something really traumatic happened to somebody that you already have a strong emotional connection with. And then the final one is experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to adverse details of traumatic events. So this would be first responders who are collecting human remains, or um, police officers, mental health professionals who are working repeatedly with children who have been sexually assaulted. That extreme exposure, those really graphic kind of gory details, can add up to the experience of trauma. So one of those four things would have happened either directly or indirectly, and in the case of experience repeated, usually that's related to work. So not a situation where you can kind of get out of it, like watching this type of thing on television or YouTube. That's not it. It's when you have to be in that situation. Okay, in addition to having that exposure, because people have been exposed to these things and don't have PTSD, in addition to that, the person with PTSD also experiences some other things. So those things can be the presence of one or more intrusion symptoms. So you think about an intrusion, somebody coming in. This is an intrusion symptom. It kind of comes in at you. Number one, recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive, distressing memories of the traumatic event. So that's not just, I remember that it happened, but I'm trying to do my job, and all of a sudden I'm remembering what's happened. I'm trying to enjoy a movie, and all of a sudden I'm remembering what has happened. So I don't have control over it. It kind of takes over. The second would be recurrent dreams. Folks with PTSD will report that they have dreams either of the actual event itself or where they feel like they are in danger in a way similar to the actual events that they experienced. And then there's also dissociative symptoms. Those are things like flashbacks. So where I'm wide awake, so it's not like a nightmare, but I'm wide awake and I feel like very strongly feel like I am in the situation that was traumatic, and very often will respond as if that traumatic situation is repeating. Next is, I've lost my place. Um, Intense or prolonged psychological distress and exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. What? Triggers. That's what they're talking about, triggers. So I'll give you an example. When a car backfires, one of my first thoughts is, ooh, car backfired. That's a very high build. Your timing belt is messed up. You're gonna have to get that to a mechanic quick. But that's because I've never been in a war zone. If I had, hearing that same sound, my first thought would be somebody just shot someone. And then if that is my first thought, my reaction might be I either need to get myself safe or I need to get those around me safe. So in both cases, it's just the sound of the car backfiring. But for the person who's experienced post traumatic stress disorder, it's taking them back to a place where they need to react in one way or another. And then finally, in this list of intrusive events is a marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I worked with a young lady who had been terribly physically and sexually abused. And one of the things I learned was that she longed to be touched. She longed to be hugged in a way that was safe. But she was so scared that something bad was going to happen because she had learned as a young child that if somebody's coming to touch you, it's going to hurt. And so one of the interventions that we had was that the people who loved and cared about her would let her know, hey, we're about to give you a hug. And I remember one of those times to say, hey, would you like to have a hug? And she nodded, and then she prepared herself. Not like this, and she waited for me to put my arm around her, and then she relaxed into it. That is responding to a very normal behavior. Somebody's putting their arm around you for a hug, but expecting really bad things to happen. That's a physiological response to, in that case, it was an external cue. The next section is about the persistent avoidance of stimuli, or trying to get away from things that might remind you of the traumatic event. That could mean avoidance or efforts to avoid distressing memories or thoughts or feelings closely associated with a traumatic event. Um, I recall shortly after my father's fatal truck accident that that intersection just was not a place that I wanted to go. So I would drive out of my way to not go through that intersection. Avoidance of efforts to um, avoidance or efforts to avoid external reminders. So people, places, conversations, activities, objects, situations that arouse distressing memories or thoughts. So in both cases, we're looking at some type of avoidance associated with PTSD. The next section, and with all of these diagnoses, there's usually two or three sections, but in the case of PTSD, which is rather complex as diagnoses go, there are quite a few different sections. Here's the next section. Negative alterations in cognition and mood associated with the traumatic event. So this could be an inability to remember certain elements of the traumatic event, just kind of putting it out of your mind almost literally. Um, Sometimes the person will have um, persistent and exaggerated beliefs like I'm bad or I'm no good or nobody can be trusted. That's one that we commonly see. Or just really unrealistic attitudes about themselves. It amazes me, particularly with children, how many of them will blame themselves for the abuse that they experienced, blame themselves um, that they didn't protect another child when it was the adult's responsibility to protect children. Such a person might just struggle to have any type of positive emotions whatsoever. I mean, why should I feel happy when my comrade has lost their limbs or lost their life? How can I be happy again? That doesn't compute anymore. Um, and there's also this idea of being detached or unable to connect with others. You may have noticed in recent years there have been quite a few public service announcements and commercials trying to get those who have experienced war to get help to be able to talk about what they have experienced. That is to combat this particular struggle, this detachment, the idea that nobody else can really understand what it is that I have been through. That is often a part of PTSD as well. And then a marked diminished interest in or participation in significant activities. And we see this with a variety of mental health disorders, particularly the mood disorders, depression, and things along those lines, where the things that used to be fun just are not fun anymore. And so the person no longer engages in them. And then here's another one that can be particularly problematic and can interfere with relationships. That is the persistent negative emotional state. So the person's always in a state of fear or horror or anger or guilt or just constantly feeling full of shame and therefore is not really able to move forward in relationships. Now to our next section, next grouping of these, marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with the traumatic events beginning or worsening after the event happened. So this is like hypervigilance or an exaggerated startle response. So you may notice, for example, after a car accident, somebody might be a little bit more jumpy when a driver slams on the brakes. That's an exaggerated startle response. Hypervigilance. I work with a client who struggles with PTSD, and anytime she goes into a new place, she very carefully checks the exits. She wants to know that in the event of an emergency, that she is close to an exit, that she knows how to get there, and that has become part of her routine. Doesn't matter what the venue, how few people are there. That's hyper vigilance. Reckless and self-destructive behavior. The thought connected to that is um, if bad things can happen at any time or randomly, or if bad things have happened to someone I care about, why should I go through the extra effort to care about myself? It's you can see how the thought process there is a bit misconstrued. Um, Another one of these is irritable behavior, angry outbursts, sometimes without any provocation. So you're thinking things are going smooth, and all of a sudden your friend is irritated and angry and has an outburst. What was that about? Well, that's likely something going on internally with it. Their mind has been triggered to a place where they felt that they were unsafe. In fact, some of the biblical counselors have described PTSD as that um, status of being stuck in the emotion you experienced when the trauma happened. So if the experience was fear, to be stuck in fear. If the experience was shame, to be stuck in shame, just to be stuck there. Um, and then, like all of the other diagnoses, um, there is a requirement that it lasts for a certain amount of time. In the case of PTSD, we're talking about 1 month. We do know that PTSD can be delayed, so the event could happen, and it could be 6 months later when all of a sudden the PTSD symptoms come up. But the symptoms must last for at least a month in order for it to really be PTSD. It also cannot be explained by other things. So, if the symptoms could better be explained by intoxication or addiction, then it's not PTSD. Intoxication and addiction. If it can be better explained by some type of physical ailment, then it's the physical ailment. It is not PTSD. And they do have some modifiers and qualifiers, but I think what we've done here today is to present what the book says are the symptoms of PTSD. And I would contend that just because it's not in the book doesn't mean it's not a symptom or of PTSD, but that's the official line. And so now that we know what it is, I would encourage you to head on over to the second video. Now that you know what it is, how do I interact with those who are experiencing this? I hope that this has been helpful to you. catch the second video, and then you're going to get off of YouTube and get into God's Word.